Hello guys. Today I am here with 3 more war ghost stories amidst the fear of war. Without further ado, let's get started. Story 1. The Ghost Colonel of Ypres. The night of November 2, 1915, was unseasonably cold along the Ypres salient in Belgium. The 1st Battalion of the Liverpool Regiment huddled in a support trench a few miles behind the front line, snatching whatever rest they could before rotating back into the hell of the salient. The men were exhausted, their faces smeared with chalk-colored mud, their eyes hollow from weeks of shelling and sniping. Among them was Private William Jones, a 23-year-old former coal miner who had enlisted amid the patriotic fervor of 1914. Now, as he leaned against the damp trench wall, patriotism felt like a distant memory replaced by a gnawing, cold dread that never left him. Their former commanding officer, Colonel Harding, had been a hard man but a fair one. A veteran of the Boer War, he had led the battalion through the chaos of Langemarck, his presence a stabilizing force amidst the slaughter. 3 weeks prior, during a nighttime inspection of forward listening posts, a German grenade had exploded near his position. The blast tore through his patrol, killing 2 men instantly and severing the colonel's left arm below the elbow. Jones remembered seeing him being carried past on a stretcher, pale as wax but still conscious, gripping the stump of his arm with his remaining hand, his jaw set in grim determination. They said he had died of his wounds before the ambulance reached the field hospital at Bailleul. That was the official story. The battalion mourned, drank to his memory, and then, as soldiers must, they moved on. Or tried to. The night of November 2nd was moonless, a thick blanket of cloud smothering the stars. Darkness. Listening for the soft clink of wire cutters or the muffled cough of a German patrol. His mind wandered to his home in Liverpool, to the narrow row house, to his mother's face, when a figure materialized out of the gloom. It was not a German patrol. It was Colonel Harding. He stood not 10 yards away, at a bend in the communication trench that led toward the forward positions. He wore his uniform exactly as Jones remembered it, the mud-caked greatcoat, the peaked cap pulled low, and his right hand resting on the holster of his Webley revolver. His left sleeve, however, was not pinned to his coat. It hung empty, folded neatly and secured, as was regulation for an amputee. Jones's blood ran cold. He wanted to cry out, to challenge the figure, but his voice was frozen in his throat. Then, the colonel moved. He walked with the same steady, measured stride Jones had followed countless times, his boots making no sound in the mud. He passed within a few feet of Jones, close enough that the private could see the familiar lines of his face, the deep-set eyes, the graying mustache. The colonel turned his head, looked directly at Jones, and gave a short, curt nod, the same acknowledgement he would give any soldier he passed on his rounds. Then, he continued down the trench toward the forward listening post known as Clapham Junction. Jones stood paralyzed for a full minute after the figure vanished into the darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs. It was a hallucination, he told himself, a trick of the exhausted mind. The strain, the lack of sleep, the grief it had conjured the colonel's image from the mud and the dark. He did not raise the alarm. What would he say? That he had seen a ghost? The story might have ended there, a private terror buried in a private's memory. But Jones was not the only witness. The next morning, the battalion was abuzz with a strange, unspoken tension. Finally, Captain Thomas Armitage, Harding's second in command, called the senior NCOs and the men who had been on watch near Clapham Junction to a briefing. His face was pale beneath his helmet. He asked a single, direct question. Did any of you see the colonel last night? A heavy silence hung in the air. Then, Sergeant Major Benson, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of service, stepped forward. I did, sir, he said, his voice rough. Around 0200 hours. He was walking the line. I could have sworn I saw his sleeve pinned up. I saluted him, sir. Habit. He just looked at me and walked on. Corporal Davies, who had been at the junction itself, corroborated the sighting. He described the colonel stopping at the precise spot where a machine gun nest was positioned, standing for a moment looking out toward no man's land, and then simply walking away, disappearing into a section of trench that had no exit. One by one, 5 men, including Jones, came forward. They all described the same thing: a silent, purposeful figure in a greatcoat, with an empty sleeve, making his final rounds. Captain Armitage listened in stunned silence. He himself had been in the dugout, trying to sleep, and had seen nothing. But he knew these men. They were not cowards prone to fantasy. They were infantrymen, hardened by war. For 5 of them to share the same detailed hallucination was impossible. He filed a report, which was later mentioned in the Liverpool Echo, describing the incident as a shared premonition or a moment where the veil between life and death had thinned. Later that day, the battalion rotated forward to Clapham Junction. They found the listening post in good order, but the 2 soldiers manning it were shaken. They had not slept. They reported that during the night, they had felt a presence, a sense of being watched by someone familiar. One of them had even called out, "Sir," into the dark, receiving only silence in return. The story of the colonel's ghostly inspection spread like wildfire through the British Expeditionary Force, becoming one of the most enduring legends of the war. But there is more to this story, something that did not appear in the Liverpool Echo and was never included in the official regimental history. Decades later, in 1933, a retired sergeant major named Albert Benson, the same man who had saluted the apparition, gave an interview to a small local newspaper in Liverpool. He was an old man by then, dying of lung disease, and he no longer cared about military secrecy or ridicule. In that interview, he revealed what Captain Armitage had ordered them to keep quiet. The colonel had been seen by more than just the 5 men who came forward. The 2 soldiers at Clapham Junction that night, the ones who were found shaken and sleepless, had not merely felt a presence. They had seen him too, but what they saw was far worse. According to Benson, the 2 soldiers, Privates Evans and Miller, had been huddled in the listening post when the colonel appeared. He did not simply walk past them. He stopped directly in front of them, looked down at their terrified faces, and spoke. His voice, they said, was not a voice at all. It was a dry rustling sound, like dead leaves scraping across frozen ground. And what he said was this: "They're coming. 3 nights. Tell them to dig." Evans and Miller had no idea what this meant. They stammered questions, but the colonel simply turned and walked into the trench wall, vanishing as if it were a doorway. Benson claimed that Captain Armitage, after hearing this, personally went to the listening post the following night. He waited in the freezing darkness, armed and alert, determined to prove it was all a delusion. He saw nothing, but at exactly 2 in the morning, he heard it: the sound of footsteps in the mud, approaching steadily. No one was there. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him, and then, a whisper, so close to his ear he felt a cold breath: "Dig." Armitage ordered the men at Clapham Junction to dig. They thought he had lost his mind. But orders were orders. For 2 days, they dug, widening the trench, reinforcing it with sandbags and timber. The men grumbled, cursed their captain, and wondered if the strain of command had finally broken him. On the 3rd night, the Germans launched one of the most intense artillery barrages of the war on that section of the line. Shell after shell rained down, obliterating trenches, burying men alive. But at Clapham Junction, the reinforced position held. Every man there survived. Captain Armitage survived as well. He never spoke of what he heard that night, not to anyone, not for the rest of his life. But in a letter found among his belongings after his death in 1958, he wrote a single, cryptic sentence: "I do not know if the dead can walk. But I know that on November 5, 1915, one of them saved my life." Private William Jones survived the war. He returned to Liverpool, to his narrow row house, to his mother's face. But he never again stood sentry duty alone in the dark. And for the rest of his life, on the night of November 2nd, he would lock his doors, light every lamp in the house, and sit in his kitchen until dawn, waiting for a sound he prayed he would never hear again. The soft, steady footsteps of a dead man making his rounds. Story 2. The Guardian Angel of Vimy Ridge. The Canadian Corps was preparing for its greatest trial, the assault on Vimy Ridge. It was April 1917, and the 7-kilometer-long escarpment held by the Germans was considered impregnable. For weeks, the Canadians had trained relentlessly, studying models of the terrain, rehearsing the advance in chalk-marked fields behind the lines. Among the thousands of men in the staging areas was Private James McIvor of the 16th Battalion, Canadian Scottish. He was a farmer's son from Nova Scotia, a quiet, religious young man who wrote home to his mother every week without fail. On the night of April 8, the eve of the battle, the front was eerily quiet. The usual crump of shells was muted, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. McIvor was lying in his dugout, trying to pray, when a profound sense of peace washed over him. He later described it as a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature. He closed his eyes and, in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw her. His mother. She was standing in their kitchen in Nova Scotia, the morning light streaming through the window onto the checked tablecloth. She looked exactly as he remembered her from his leave before shipping out. Her graying hair pinned up, her hands flour dusted from baking. She turned from the table and looked directly at him, a look of such intense love and concern that his heart ached. Then, she spoke. He did not hear her with his ears, but her voice was clear as a bell in his mind. "Jamie," she said, using his childhood name, "be careful, my son." They are waiting. The vision dissolved, leaving McIvor in the cold darkness of the dugout, tears streaming down his face. He was not afraid. He felt strangely comforted, even as the warning chilled him. He told his friend, Private Alec Monroe, what he had seen. Monroe, a pragmatic fisherman from Newfoundland, just grunted, "Go to sleep, Jamie. You are just nerves." But McIvor could not shake the feeling that his mother had somehow bridged 3,000 miles to reach him. 0 hour came. The morning of April 9th dawned cold and gray, a sleet storm lashing the faces of the advancing Canadians. McIvor and Monroe went over the top together, struggling through the mud and craters as machine gun fire tore into the ranks around them. The assault was brutal, a desperate scramble from shell hole to shell hole. Men fell on all sides, their screams lost in the roar of artillery. By mid-morning, they had reached the intermediate line, their unit decimated. Exhausted, they took cover in a large shell crater with 2 other soldiers, awaiting the order to push forward to the final objective, the highest point of the ridge known as the Pimple. McIvor was spent. He slumped against the muddy wall of the crater, his mind blank with fatigue. He thought of his mother's kitchen, the warmth, the safety. And then, he saw her again. This time, she was not in the kitchen. She was standing on the lip of the crater, about 20 yards away, looking directly at him. She was as solid and real as any living person, her dress incongruous against the blasted lunar landscape. She raised her hand and pointed, not toward the German lines ahead, but to the left, along the base of the crater. Her expression was urgent, pleading. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, dissolving into the sleet. "Alec," McIvor croaked, grabbing Monroe's arm. "Did you see her, my mother?" Monroe looked at him like he was mad. "See who? There is no one there, Jamie. Get a grip on yourself." But McIvor was already moving. Acting on an instinct he could not explain, he scrambled out of the crater, crawling on his belly toward the spot where his mother had pointed. Monroe cursed and followed, not wanting to leave his friend. They had not gone more than 15 yards when the world behind them exploded. A German heavy artillery shell, a Jack Johnson, had scored a direct hit on the exact shell hole they had just vacated. The 2 other soldiers who had been huddling there were obliterated, their bodies dismembered beyond recognition by the blast. McIvor and Monroe lay flat as the earth shook, debris raining down on them. When the shockwave passed, they looked back. Where the crater had been was now a much larger, smoking hole. There was no sign of their comrades. Monroe stared, his face ashen. He looked at McIvor, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrified awe. "Your mother," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I did not see her, Janie. But she was there." The war continued. McIvor survived Vimy Ridge. He fought at Passchendaele, at Amiens, through the 100 Days offensive. He was wounded twice, but he always came through. And every night, he wrote to his mother. He never told her the full story in his letters, not wanting to frighten her. But when he finally returned to Nova Scotia in 1919, he sat her down at the kitchen table, the very table from his vision, and told her everything. She listened in silence, her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. When he finished, she reached out and took his hand. "That night, Jamie," she said softly, "I could not sleep. I was so worried about you. I sat here at this table, praying, begging God to keep you safe. And then, I felt strange. I cannot explain it. It was like I was pulled away, like I was somewhere else, a cold, dark place full of noise. I saw you, Jamie. You looked so tired, so scared. I just wanted to warn you, to bring you to safety." For the rest of his life, James McIvor never doubted that something beyond the rational world watched over him on Vimy Ridge. He married, raised a family, and worked the same farm his mother had worked before him. But there was one thing he never did. He never again slept through the night of April 8th. Every year, on the anniversary of the vision, he would wake at exactly 2 in the morning, sit up in bed, and stare at the empty corner of his bedroom. His wife would ask him what was wrong. He would always give the same answer: nothing. Just remembering. His daughter, Mary, later wrote a small memoir of her father's life, published in a local historical society journal in 1965. In it, she described a peculiar habit of his. Every evening, before bed, he would walk to the kitchen window and look out at the darkness for several minutes, as if expecting someone. One night, when she was a young girl, she asked him who he was looking for. He smiled, a sad, distant smile, and said, "My guardian angel." She has a long way to come. James McIvor died in 1975 at the age of 82. In his final hours, delirious with fever, he spoke constantly to someone only he could see. His daughter, sitting by his bedside, heard him say clearly, "I knew you would come. I knew you would not let me go alone." Then he smiled, closed his eyes, and was gone. On his bedside table, they found a photograph of his mother, taken in 1917. On the back, in his shaky, elderly handwriting, were written 3 words: "She came back." Story 3. The Giant of Kandahar. The Tora Bora Mountains had just been pounded into rubble. December 2001 had seen B-52s turn the cave complexes of Al-Qaeda into tombs. By early 2002, the remnants of the enemy had fled across the border or melted into the villages, and American forces were engaged in mop-up operations, hunting for holdouts and intelligence. It was during this chaotic period, in a remote corner of Kandahar province, that a 12-man Green Beret Operational Detachment Alpha found itself confronting something that defied every piece of military doctrine they knew. The team was inserted by helicopter at dusk, tasked with establishing an observation post on a ridgeline overlooking a valley rumored to be a transit route for high-value targets. The insertion was quiet, the landing zone a small, flat area surrounded by jagged rocks. As the helicopter lifted away, the silence of the mountains descended upon them. The team leader, a seasoned master sergeant whom we will call Mitch, quickly moved his men off the landing zone and into a defensive position among the boulders. They set up for the night, establishing a hide site with clear fields of fire. The air was cold, thin, and utterly still. Around 2 in the morning, the soldier on watch, a young staff sergeant we will call Danny, heard something. It was not a voice or a footstep. but a sound he could not place. A deep, rhythmic scraping, like a massive stone being dragged across rock. He woke Mitch, who listened for a moment, then heard it too. It seemed to come from a spine of rock about 100 meters to their north. Using night vision, they scanned the area. At first, they saw nothing. The scraping continued, a slow, deliberate sound. Then, one of the soldiers whispered, his voice tight with fear, "Contact." North, large. Through the green glow of their night optical devices, they saw a figure. It was standing upright, and it was enormous. Estimates later varied, but all the men agreed it was at least 12 feet tall, possibly more. It was humanoid but impossibly proportioned, with broad shoulders and long, powerful arms. It was covered in dark hair or fur, and it seemed to be holding something long and thin, a spear, or perhaps a sharpened length of metal. It stood motionless for a moment, facing their position, as if it knew exactly where they were. Then, it took a step forward, the scraping sound echoing across the rocks. Mitch's training kicked in. He had a team of 12 Americans in a non-permissive environment, and a potential hostile was approaching. He signaled for his men to hold fire, hoping the creature would simply pass by. But it did not. It continued its slow, deliberate advance, its massive form silhouetted against the stars. When it was within 50 meters, it stopped again. Then, with a speed that belied its size, it hurled the object it was carrying. The spear flew through the air with terrifying accuracy, striking one of the Green Berets square in the chest. The soldier, a medic, went down without a sound, the crude weapon piercing his body armor as if it were cloth. All hell broke loose. The Americans opened fire with their M4 carbines, the night erupting in muzzle flashes and the deafening crack of gunfire. They aimed center mass at the giant, emptying magazine after magazine. The creature staggered under the hail of bullets but did not fall immediately. It let out a roar, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the men's chests, before finally crumpling to the rocky ground. The shooting stopped, and eerie silence returned, broken only by the ragged breathing of the soldiers and the whimpers of their fallen comrade. They rushed to the medic, but it was too late. The spear had impaled him. He died within minutes. As dawn broke, the team approached the body of their attacker. They found a creature unlike anything in any briefing or intelligence report. It was bipedal, covered in thick, reddish-brown hair. Its face was vaguely human but with a sloping brow and a heavy jaw. Its hands and feet were oversized and powerfully built. The spear it had thrown was crudely made but effective, a sharpened piece of metal lashed to a wooden shaft. It was, by any definition, a giant. The team was in shock. They had a man down, killed by a mythical creature. Mitch immediately radioed for an emergency extraction and a quick reaction force. When the helicopters arrived, they brought not just reinforcements but also a contingent from a unit the Green Berets had never seen before, men in non-standard uniforms who took charge of the scene with chilling efficiency. They photographed the creature, bagged the spear as evidence, and loaded the massive body onto a cargo net slung beneath a Chinook helicopter. Before the helicopter lifted off, a senior officer pulled Mitch aside. His words were brief and unambiguous. "You did not see anything last night. Your man died from an enemy ambush. A stray round. That is the report. That is the truth." The Green Berets were medevaced out, the body of their comrade and the creature gone. They were debriefed separately, repeatedly, and warned, under threat of court-martial, never to speak of what they had seen. The official record shows a soldier killed in action in the mountains of Kandahar. But the men who were there know the truth, and over the years, fragments of that truth have leaked out. One of the team members, speaking anonymously to a researcher years later, revealed that the debriefing was far more intense than anyone expected. They were not simply told to forget. They were questioned for hours about every detail. The creature's appearance, its movements, the sound it made. They were shown photographs of similar creatures, taken in other parts of the world, and asked if any of them matched what they had seen. They were told, in no uncertain terms, that this was not an isolated incident. The researcher, who documented this account in a small circulation journal, also discovered something else. The spear that killed the medic was not a primitive weapon crafted by some isolated tribe. The metal tip was analyzed and found to be a type of steel not manufactured anywhere in the region. It was, according to the analyst, consistent with meteoritic iron, a type of metal found in ancient artifacts and, occasionally, in objects of unknown origin. The soldier who was killed, the medic, had a name. He had a family. He had a wife and a young daughter back in the United States. The official story, the one his family was told, was that he died in a firefight with Al-Qaeda insurgents. He was buried with full military honors, a hero's funeral, a folded flag presented to his weeping widow. But the men who were with him that night know that his killer was no insurgent. It was something far older, far stranger, and far more terrifying. It was a creature that should not exist, in a war that made no sense, in a land that has harbored secrets for millennia. Years later, Mitch, the team leader, retired from the military and tried to build a normal life. He married, had children, worked a civilian job, but he never slept well. He never stopped looking over his shoulder, and he never, ever went camping or hiking in remote areas. His wife noticed that he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, staring at the window. When she asked him what was wrong, he would always say the same thing: "I can still hear the scraping." One night, in 2015, he finally told her the whole story. He had kept it bottled up for 13 years. When he finished, he broke down and wept, something she had never seen him do. He said, "I keep thinking about that roar, that sound. It was not an animal. It was not human. It was something in between. And I just know, that whatever it was not alone out there. There are more of them, and they are waiting." Mitch died of a heart attack in 2018 at the age of 52. His wife, going through his belongings, found a locked metal box in his closet. Inside, she found a single photograph, grainy and dark, taken with a night vision camera. It showed a massive, upright figure, covered in hair, holding what appeared to be a spear. On the back of the photograph, in her husband's handwriting, were 4 words: "I did not forget." She burned the photograph. She never told anyone what she had seen. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows through the trees and branches scrape against the house, she hears it too. The scraping. And she understands why her husband could never sleep. The giant of Kandahar remains one of the most closely guarded and terrifying footnotes of the War on Terror. Officially, it never happened. Unofficially, the men who were there carry the memory with them every day, a secret so heavy it has crushed some of them entirely. They went to war expecting to fight terrorists. They found something far worse. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, in caves that have not seen sunlight for millennia, its kin are still waiting. Like and subscribe to the channel to get more new videos.